The courtroom hung thick with a silence so oppressive it seemed to press down on everyone. Within its walls, a suffocating weight that settled into the lungs and refused to let go. Each breath felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself carried the burden of what was about to unfold. The polished wooden floors gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the tension that pulsed through the room. Then came the sound-sharp, deliberate, commanding heavy thud of boots striking the ground, reverberating like a drumbeat in the stillness. Officer Bradley Morris didn't just walk. He advanced, his every step a proclamation of dominance, a declaration that this space belonged to him. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, his uniform pristine, the shine of his badge catching the light as if to remind everyone of the power it represented. He moved with the swagger of a man who believed the world bent to his will, a man who saw the law not as a boundary, but as a tool to wield. In the center of this storm stood a woman, her presence a stark contrast to the chaos he brought. She was tall, her posture unyielding, her dark eyes steady and piercing beneath the weight of his glare. Her suit was impeccable, sharp lines and deep navy fabric that spoke of quiet strength, and her hands rested calmly at her sides, betraying none of the turmoil that might have churned within. She had faced men like him before, too many times to count, men who wore their authority like armor, who used it to shield their contempt, their prejudice, their rage. She had seen the way they looked at her, the way their lips curled when she dared to speak, the way they assumed she was less because of the skin she lived in. But she had never faltered, not once. Her life had been a series of battles fought in silence, each victory carved out of a system that had never welcomed her. And now, here she stood, dignity radiating from her like a beacon, even as his shadow loomed closer. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension as he stopped just feet away, his gaze raking over her with a mixture of disdain and amusement. She opened her mouth, her voice cutting through the stillness, not loud, not trembling, but firm as steel. "You need to respect the people in this courtroom," she said, her words simple yet heavy with meaning. It was a plea for decency, a reminder of the professionalism he was bound to uphold, a quiet demand that he recognize the humanity of those around him. But to him, it was a challenge, an affront. His lips twisted into a scoff, a sound that dripped with mockery, as if the very notion of a black woman daring to instruct him was absurd. His fingers twitched near his belt, hovering over the holstered gun, and for a fleeting moment, the room held its breath. Would he draw it? Would he turn this confrontation into something darker, something irreversible? The possibility hung there, electric and terrifying. But he didn't. Instead, he smirked, his face contorting with a smugness that spoke of countless moments like this moment's, where he'd pushed boundaries, crossed lines, and walked away unscathed. He took a step closer, towering over her, his jaw clenching as he sized her up. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to stretch time itself, he spat. The warm saliva struck her cheek, a wet smear sliding down her skin, a visceral embodiment of every slight, every insult, every ounce of venom he carried in his soul. It wasn't just an act of disrespect, it was a declaration of war, a message that he saw her as beneath him, unworthy of even basic regard. The courtroom erupted into chaos, though it was a chaos of stillness at first. The walls themselves seemed to shudder, recoiling from the ugliness of what had just transpired. A collective gasp tore through the onlookers, attorneys, clerks, spectator seats sound a raw, jagged edge of disbelief. Eyes widened, hands flew to mouths, and a murmur began to ripple through the crowd, growing louder with every passing second. But no one moved, no one dared to intervene. This wasn't something they'd been trained to handle, not in a place meant to uphold justice. The bailiff, a weary man with graying hair and a perpetually tired expression, shifted uncomfortably in his corner, his fingers tightening around the edge of his chair. The young attorney at the prosecution table, barely out of law school, stared with her pen frozen mid-air, her breath caught in her throat. Even the older spectators, who'd seen decades of courtroom dramas unfold, sat rigid, their faces pale with shock. Bradley, though, was unmoved, his smirk widened, his eyes glinting with a sick sort of glee as he leaned in closer, his breath hot against her face. "What are you going to do about it?" he whispered, his voice low and taunting, laced with the kind of arrogance that only came from years of knowing the system would shield him. He'd done worse, far worse than this. He'd shouted slurs in dimly lit holding cells, roughed up suspects in back alleys, laughed with his buddies over beers about the complaints that never stuck. The badge on his chest wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a free pass, a guarantee that no matter how far he went, someone would look the other way. He fully expected this moment to fade into the same pattern, another story to brag about, another victory over someone he deemed powerless. But she didn't give him what he wanted. She didn't flinch, didn't scream, didn't raise a hand to wipe the spit from her face. She stood there, statuesque, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through him. Inside, her mind was a storm, memories of every time she'd been dismissed, every time she'd been told she didn't belong, every time she'd had to swallow her anger to survive. But on the outside, she was a fortress, unshakable. She could have exploded, could have let the fury bubbling beneath her surface spill over, could have made this personal and given him the reaction he craved. Instead, she chose silence, letting the weight of his actions hang in the air, letting the room feel the magnitude of his disgrace. When she finally spoke, her voice was a blade of calm, measured, devoid of the emotion he could twist against her. "Are you finished?" she asked, each syllable deliberate, her tone as steady as the marble beneath her feet. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, a crack in his bravado, a shadow of uncertainty. He blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me," he barked, his scoff returning, though it sounded less certain now, more forced. She tilted her head ever so slightly, her eyes never leaving his, her presence growing larger with every second. "I asked if you were finished," she repeated, her words carrying a quiet power that seemed to fill the room. And that was when the tide turned. The murmurs in the courtroom shifted, no longer just gasps of horror, but whispers of something deeper, realization, recognition, a dawning truth that Bradley hadn't yet grasped. The bailiff's grip on his chair loosened, his tired eyes narrowing as he watched her. The young attorney's pen dropped to the table, her wide-eyed shock giving way to a spark of awe. The spectators exchanged glances, their murmurs growing into a low hum of anticipation. They saw it now, even if he didn't. They understood what he was too blind, too arrogant, to see. Because the woman he'd just spat on, the woman he'd humiliated in front of a room full of witness, wasn't just anyone. She was Judge Naomi Carter, the arbiter of this courtroom, a woman who'd spent her life fighting for justice in a world that rarely offered it to people like her. And what came next wasn't just a reprimand, wasn't just a suspension or a slap on the wrist. It was a reckoning, a lesson in consequences that would strip away every ounce of his smug certainty. Justice, it turned out, wasn't blind today. It had a face, a name, and a power he couldn't escape. Across the courthouse, the morning had begun like any other. The air carried the familiar sense of stale coffee, worn paper, and polished wood, a mix that clung to the halls like a memory. Clerks shuffled files, attorneys muttered over case notes, and the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. But beneath it all was a tension, a weight that only existed in places where power ruled, where lives hung in the balance of words and gavels. Naomi had walked these halls countless times, her heels clicking against the marble with a rhythm that spoke of purpose. She'd earned her place here, clawing her way through a system that had never been built for her, a black woman from a family with no legacy of wealth or influence, the first to claim a seat at the table. Every glance thrown her way, every whispered doubt, had only fueled her resolve. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd turned adversity into strength, her sharp suits and unwavering gaze a testament to her refusal to bend. Bradley, on the other hand, strutted through the same halls like a king in his own mind. His boots gleamed, his belt creaked with every step, and his eyes scanned the space as if daring anyone to challenge him. He was the kind of man who thrived on fear, who saw his badge as a crown and his gun as a scepter. To him, the courthouse was just another stage for his performance, a place where he could flex his power and walk away laughing. He'd never known a fight he couldn't win, never faced a consequence he couldn't dodge, until today. The lesson that unfolded in that courtroom wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was a mirror held up to a world where power too often shielded cruelty, where justice was a promise too rarely kept. Naomi didn't just stand her ground, she reclaimed it, turning his arrogance into a weapon against him. And as the gavel fell, as the room watched in stunned silence, the message was clear: those who abuse power will one day answer for it, and the scales of justice, when wielded by someone unbroken, can tip in ways no one expects. Bradley Morris had worn his badge for over 10 years, a tarnished shield he treated not as a symbol of duty, but as a golden ticket, granting him free rein to act as he pleased. His name floated through the precinct and the streets alike, carried on hushed breaths and nervous glances from those unlucky enough to cross his shadow. He'd been at it long enough to master the game, knowing precisely how far he could stretch the rules before they snapped back, though they never did. The system, he'd learned early, wasn't designed to hold men like him accountable. It cradled them, shielded them, so long as they wore the uniform and played their hands with a sly grin. Complaints had piled up over the years, whispers of excessive force, of arrests that left men crumpled and bleeding in alleys, of routine traffic stops that spiraled into something darker, uglier. Each time, the machinery of the force whirred into motion to protect him. Fellow officers spun stories, superiors averted their gazes, and the reports vanished into some bureaucratic abyss. Why would he stop? He didn't believe in justice, and not the lofty kind poets wrote about anyway. Fairness was a fairy tale. What mattered was order, the kind he enforced with an iron fist, the kind that kept everyone in their rightful place, the world spinning just as it always had. That morning, when the call came to assist in the courtroom, Bradley strode in with the same swagger he always carried, boots clicking against the polished floor, his chest puffed out beneath the crisp blue of his uniform. It was supposed to be another mundane day, another defendant shuffling in, clutching delusions of rights they didn't truly possess, another judge nodding along as if the law cared about anyone but the ones holding the reins. He expected monotony, the familiar rhythm of power tilting in his favor. But then he saw her. She didn't fit the script. She wasn't slumped behind the defense table, wasn't dressed in the faded garb of the accused. She stood there, a black woman, her posture straight, her voice ringing out with an authority that grated against every nerve in his body. To Bradley, she didn't belong in that space, not with that tone. His instincts flared, the same ones that had guided him through countless confrontations, the tightening of his gut during a traffic stop, the curl of his fist before a blow, the snap decision of who deserved deference and who deserved none. She fell squarely into the latter camp, her voice cut through the air, too steady, too calm, too unshaken. He despised that sound, the kind that didn't quiver or plead, the kind that dared to stand firm against him, without a second thought, without even a flicker of hesitation, to consider the room he stood in or the eyes watching. Bradley did what came naturally, what he'd done 100 times before. When someone dared step out of line, he leaned in close, his breath hot and deliberate, and let a glob of spit fly from his lips. It struck her cheek, warm and slow, sliding down her skin in a calculated act of contempt. It wasn't just spit, it was a message, a proclamation carved in venom. You are nothing. You are beneath me. No matter her clothes, her stance, or whatever title she clung to, she'd never rise above him in his world. The courtroom fell silent, a thick, suffocating hush swallowing every rustle of paper, every creak of a chair. Bradley stood there, chest heaving slightly, waiting for the reaction. He craveteers, a flinch, a crack in her composure. But then she spoke. Her voice sliced through the stillness, low and unshaken, carrying a weight that seemed to pull the air itself taut. Are you finished? The question wasn't loud, wasn't laced with fury or shock. It was worse. It was absolute, unyielding certainty. Something shifted in that moment, a ripple Bradley couldn't yet grasp. The room tilted, though he didn't feel the ground move beneath his boots. The eyes around him, clerks perched at their desks, attorneys frozen mid-breath, spectators leaning forward changed. Their gazes sharpened, not with pity for her, but with something heavier, something aimed at him. He didn't see it yet, didn't understand. His smirk wavered, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but he squared his shoulders, forcing a scoff to brush off the unease clawing at his ribs. You don't get to tell me how to do my job, he muttered, his tone dripping with condescension, his fingers flexing at his sides as if itching to grab something, to reassert control. She tilted her head, just a fraction, her eyes locked on his incredible, piercing, like she was peeling back every layer of him, cataloging every flicker of arrogance, every tremble he didn't know he had. There was no rage in her stare, no fire he could latch onto and fight, just patience, a patience that chilled him, though he'd never admit it. Around them, the courtroom buzzed with quiet life. A woman in the front row shifted, her lips brushing the ear of the man beside her as she whispered something, her eyes darting between Bradley and the woman he'd defiled. A clerk near the back fidgeted, his pen hovering over his notepad, his hand half raised as if torn between stepping in and staying invisible. Another man cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence, a nervous tick breaking the tension. Bradley noticed none of it. His world was still his owner, so he thought. The woman before him took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling with a deliberate calm that mocked his unraveling. She nodded, almost to herself, and stepped back. When she spoke again, her voice was crisp, a blade wrapped in velvet. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Officer Morris." His name in her mouth felt like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, unsettling him in ways he couldn't name. "Are you finished?" His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin. Something foreign slithered through him doubt. Maybe, though he'd never call it that. He forced a laugh, sharp and jagged, shoving the feeling down. "Lady, you're lucky I'm not arresting you for obstruction," he said, lifting his chin, his voice loud enough to reclaim the room. "You think you can waltz into a courtroom and tell an officer of the law how to do his job? Who the hell do you think you are?" The words echoed, bold and brash, but they hung there, unanswered, as the silence deepened. She didn't flinch, didn't snap back. She moved not toward him, not away, but with a subtle grace that seemed to expand her presence, filling the space he'd tried to choke out of her. Her gaze swept the room, slow and deliberate, taking in every face, every held breath. Then, in a single, fluid motion, she turned and began to walk. Bradley's smirk froze as she glided past him, past the attorneys with their tense shoulders, past the wide-eyed onlookers clutching their coats, past the row of officers near the door. Those men his brothers in blue shifted uncomfortably, their hands gripping their belts, their faces a gallery of dread and dawning realization. She didn't rush, didn't falter. Her steps were measured, each one a hammer striking the anvil of his certainty. The weight in his gut sank lower, a cold, creeping dread he couldn't shake. It wasn't until she reached the bench judge's bench, her bench, that the truth slammed into him, a freight train of consequence he'd never seen coming. She sat, adjusting the microphone with a quiet precision, folding her hands as if the moment were ordinary. The woman he'd spat on, the woman he'd dismissed with every ounce of his bloated pride, was the judge presiding over this courtroom. His mind reeled, scrambling to rewrite the scene into something less damning. This couldn't be real. He'd misread her clothes, her demeanor, the way she'd stood there like she owned the place. But she did. She owned it all. The room's energy had shifted entirely now, a simmering tension replacing the earlier shock. People sat straighter, their eyes locked on the tableau unfolding before them, unable to tear away from the inevitable. Bradley stood rooted, his boots heavy as lead, watching her settle into her seat. She didn't look at him, not yet. She didn't need to. The faint glisten of his spit still clung to her cheek, a mark of his hubris. But it didn't diminish her, it condemned him. In that moment, Bradley's world built on a decade of unchecked power, of bending the system to his will, tilted and cracked. He'd always believed himself untouchable, a king in a kingdom of his own making. But now, the whispers around him grew into a storm. The eyes of the room bore into him like daggers, and the woman he'd tried to break sat above him, her authority absolute. Justice, the kind he'd mocked as a myth, loomed over him now, patient and unyielding. The lesson was clear, etched into the silence of the courtroom. Power abused would one day demand its reckoning. And for Bradley Morris, that day had come. The courtroom was steeped in a silence so profound it seemed to hum, a living thing that pressed against every corner of the space, wrapping itself around the worn wooden benches, the scuffed floor, the high ceiling with its peeling paint. It was a silence that didn't need words to do its work. It had already stripped the air bare, leaving nothing but raw, unfiltered tension. And then she spoke. Her voice cut through the stillness like a blade, sharp and deliberate, each syllable landing with the weight of inevitability. "Officer Morris," she said, and the way his name rolled off her tongue wasn't soft or cautious like it might have been once. No, now it was thick, heavy, a pronouncement that seemed to echo inside his skull. Bradley Morris stood there, his mouth suddenly parched, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth as he swallowed hard, the sound embarrassingly loud in the quiet. His throat bobbed, a dry, rasping gulp that betrayed the nerves he'd spent years pretending he didn't have. "I want you to think very carefully about your next move," she continued, her tone steady, devoid of rage or speed, just a calm, patient cadence that chilled him to his core. It was the kind of patience that didn't rush, didn't falter, the kind that waited for you to stumble into the trap you'd built for yourself. She wasn't digging his grave for him, she was handing him the shovel and watching, expectant. His heart thudded against his ribcage, a frantic rhythm that felt like it might bruise him from the inside out. For the first time since he'd pinned that badge to his chest, since he'd been handed the kind of unchecked power that let him stride through years of bent rules and broken lives without a backward glance, Bradley felt something alien slither into his gut. It wasn't just fear, it was smallness, a shrinking sensation that made his broad shoulders hunch inward, his 6-foot frame suddenly fragile. This was the feeling he'd seen in the eyes of the people he'd towered over, the ones he'd pushed against walls or shoved into the back of his cruiser, the ones whose pleas he'd ignored with a smirk. He'd inflicted this 100 times, 1,000, but never once had he imagined it would turn on him, sinking its claws into his chest, whispering that this time he wasn't the one in control. She was, and whatever she did next, whatever unraveling awaited him, he knew deep in the marrow of his bones that it wouldn't be something he could shrug off or walk away from unscathed. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with an unspoken pressure that clung to every surface. Bradley had been here more times than he could count, his boots scuffing the same faded tiles, his elbows resting casually against the same chipped railings. He'd slouched in the back row, arms crossed over his chest, watching the parade of defendants shuffle, nervous, broken, defiant, watching their stories play out like predictable scripts he'd memorized long ago. He'd seen tears fall, seen lives pivot on a single ruling, seen justice doled out in quick, mechanical bursts like a cashier ringing up a sale. It was routine, impersonal, a machine he'd learned to navigate without ever feeling its gears turn against him. But now, standing in the center of this familiar space, he was no longer the observer. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked on him, their gazes prickling against his skin like hot needles, waiting for him to crack, to speak, to do something. The heat of their stares crawled up his neck, flushing his face, and he fought the urge to tug at his collar, to wipe the sweat beading on his brow. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He'd walked through those double doors that morning with the same swagger he always carried, the unshakable confidence of a man who'd never had to explain himself, never had to bow his head. For years, he'd worn his authority like a second skin armor that made him untouchable, unquestioned. He'd spoken with that gruff certainty, moved with that lazy arrogance, secure in the belief that his actions were fleeting, inconsequential, erased the moment he turned his back. But now, pinned beneath this suffocating silence, he felt the weight of something permanent settle over him, something he couldn't outrun. He was facing a woman he'd dismissed without a second thought, a woman he'd insulted in a way that should have been forgotten by now, brushed off like dust. Except she wasn't dust. She was Judge Naomi Carter, and in this room, she was everything. She sat behind the bench, a figure carved from stone, her presence as immovable as the thick oak walls that framed the courtroom. Her face gave nothing away, no flicker of emotion, no hint of what churned beneath the surface. Her silence wasn't just absence, it was a force, a weapon she wielded with devastating precision. Bradley had braced himself for something else, an explosion of anger, a sharp demand for respect, maybe even a call for the bailiff to haul him out. He could have handled that. He'd spent his career dodging fury, letting it bounce off him like rain on a windshield, laughing it off with the other guys over beers later. But this quiet, unyielding stillness, it unnerved him in a way nothing ever had. She wasn't reacting, she was waiting, letting him stew in the mess he'd made, letting him feel every second of his own unraveling. It was a masterstroke of control, and it left him floundering. He shifted his weight, his boots squeaking faintly against the floor, and the stiffness in his body hit him all at once. His shoulders ached, locked tight with tension, his neck rigid as if he'd been holding his breath for hours. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and jagged, a desperate attempt to break the quiet, to claw back some semblance of the man he'd been when he walked in. This is he started, but the words faltered, his voice thinner than he'd meant it to be, stretched taut and brittle. He stopped, swallowing again, and forced a scoff, shaking his head like he could shake off the dread curling in his stomach. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, louder this time, clinging to the bravado that had always been his shield. It was a flimsy performance, and he knew it. Judge Carter didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just watched him, her eyes steady and piercing, like a hawk tracking a rabbit darting through the grass. "What's ridiculous, Officer Morris?" she asked, her voice smooth and even, a quiet challenge wrapped in velvet. She didn't need to raise it. Every word landed like a stone, deliberate and unshakable. She knew the answer, but she wanted him to say it, wanted to see him squirm as he tried to talk his way out of a pit with no escape. His pulse quickened, a staccato beat hammering in his ears. He wasn't used to this scrutiny, this spotlight. He wasn't the one who got questioned. He was the one who asked, who demanded, who walked away. He squared his shoulders, forcing his spine straight, trying to summon the defiance that had carried him through every close call. "This," he said, waving a hand vaguely at the space between them, as if that gesture could sum up the chaos spinning in his head. "This whole thing, the way you're looking at me, like I did something wrong, like he hesitated, the words tangling on his tongue, like I disrespected, like you disrespected the court," she cut in, her tone sharpening just enough to slice through his stammering, leaving no room for excuses. His jaw tightened, teeth grinding together with a faint, audible scrape. "You're trying to twist this into something it's not," he shot back, but the defiance felt hollow, a reflex more than a conviction. She leaned forward then, just a fraction, but it was enough to shift the air in the room, to remind him of the gavel resting inches from her hand, the power she held in her steady grip. "Then explain it to me," she said, her voice cool and detached, a quiet lethality threading through it. "Tell me what this is, Officer Morris." He opened his mouth, ready to fire back with something, anything, and nothing came. His mind scrambled, grasping for a lie, a spin, a way to turn this back on her. But every excuse evaporated before it could form. For the first time, he was facing someone who wouldn't let him rewrite the narrative, someone who saw through every dodge and feint he'd perfected over the years. His stomach churned, a sick twist of nausea, and his fingers twitched at his sides, itching to clench into fists. He glanced toward the back of the room, where his fellow officers stood in a loose cluster near the exit. He searched their face, Tom with his perpetual smirk, Jenkins with his quiet loyalty for some flicker of support, some silent promise that they'd back him up like always. But they were still, their expressions blank, their eyes fixed somewhere past him. No nods, no stepped forward shoulders, no muttered assurances. They knew something he was only just grasping. This wasn't a storm he could ride out with a wink. And a favor, this time, he was on his own. He dragged his gaze back to Judge Carter, the weight in his chest sinking deeper, pulling at his ribs. She reached for a folder on her desk, her movements slow and deliberate, like a surgeon preparing to cut. She flipped it open, the soft rustle of paper deafening in the quiet, and her eyes skimmed the paged words she'd clearly read before, words she'd committed to memory. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, until she finally looked up at him. "You have a history, Officer Morris," she said, her voice low but resonant, each word a hammer striking steel. His breath hitched, his throat closing around a weak scoff that barely reached her. What is this?" he managed, but the question sounded pathetic, a plea disguised as bluster. "This isn't a trial," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact, almost gentle, though the words sent a jolt of panic racing down his spine. "Not yet." She paused, letting that sink in, then began to read aloud. Multiple complaints of excessive force. His stomach lurched, a violent twist that made him sway slightly. Unlawful detainment. his hands curled into fists, nails biting into his palms. Use of intimidation tactics against civilians, including minors. The room seemed to shrink, the walls creeping closer, the air thinning. She turned a page, her fingers steady, her voice unrelenting. Every single one of these complaints dismissed, buried under paperwork, lost in a system that conveniently forgot to look too hard. She stopped, her eyes locking onto his. "Tell me, Officer Morris," she said, her voice a quiet thunder, "do you believe in accountability?" His breath caught, trapped in his lungs, his body rigid as if he'd been bolted to the floor. His mind raced, clawing for an escape, a deflection, anything to tip the scales back in his favor. But there was nothing, just the stark, unyielding truth staring him down. "I do," he croaked, the words barely audible, a lie he didn't even believe himself. "Do you believe in consequences?" She pressed, her gaze unwavering, peeling back every layer of bravado until he stood there, raw and exposed. The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. A mirror held up to years of abuses he'd never thought would catch up to him. Justice, he'd always thought, was a tool he wielded, not a force that could turn on him. But now, in the shadow of Judge Carter's bench, he saw it for what it was, a reckoning. Patient and inevitable, waiting for the moment when power overstepped too far. And as the silence closed in again, he realized with a cold, sinking certainty that his moment had come. Bradley Morris stood there, his entire being trembling under a burden so heavy it seemed to anchor him to the spot. His lips parted as if to speak, then clamped shut again, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like a relentless drum. The air around him thickened with tension, and across from him, Judge Naomi Carter's voice sliced through the haze, calm, deliberate, and carrying an unmistakable finality that left no room for doubt. "This isn't because of anything I've done," she said, her tone steady yet infused with a resolve that hit him like a physical blow. "I believe in consequences, Officer Morris, and I believe it's long past time you faced yours." In that instant, the ground beneath Bradley seemed to dissolve, leaving him suspended in a void where everything he'd built his career, his reputation, the unshakable certainty of his own authority crumbled into dust. For the first time in his 42 years, he tasted the bitter sting of powerlessness, a sensation so foreign it clawed at his chest and left him gasping. The silence that followed her words wasn't just weighty, it was a living thing, oppressive and suffocating, seeping into every crevice of the courtroom. It pressed against him, coiling around his body like an invisible chain, tightening with every uneven breath he fought to conceal. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, and a desperate urge surged within him to deny it all, to claw back the control slipping through his fingers like sand. But deep down, he knew it was futile. The truth pulsed through him, as real as the heat creeping up his neck, as undeniable as the hammering at his temples. The courtroom wasn't merely observing him now, it was a predator, poised and expectant, every eye trained on him, waiting for his next move. His hands balled into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening as his body locked in place, rigid with defiance yet trapped with nowhere to run. Judge Carter let the silence stretch, her face an unreadable mask, her dark eyes piercing through him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. She wasn't just watching, she was dissecting him, peeling back the layers of bravado he'd worn like armor, forcing him to sit in the festering discomfort of his own making. Accountability, a concept he'd dodged his entire career, now loomed before him, an inescapable specter he could no longer outrun. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing tighter, a physical manifestation of the panic swelling inside him. This is some kind of setup," he muttered, his voice raw and jagged, scraping against the stillness as he tried to shatter the weight crushing him. "You think you can just pull this out of nowhere, act like you're what, Officer Morris?" Judge Carter's response was a blade, smooth yet razor-sharp, cutting through his stammering with surgical precision. "Like you haven't spent your career abusing the authority handed to you. Like you haven't silenced those who dared to challenge you. Like you haven't cowered behind that badge every time someone questioned your actions." Her words hung in the air, each one a hammer striking at the foundation of his identity. His throat burned, dry as ash, his body igniting under the relentless gaze of the room, not just hers, but the scattered onlookers, the bailiffs, the the clerks'll witnesses to his unraveling. I've done my job, he ground out, his voice low and guttural, fists tightening until his nails bit into his palms. I've kept order. I've kept these streets. You've terrorized the very people you swore to protect, she cut in, her voice still measured, but now carrying an unshakable force, a quiet fury that brooked no argument. And every time the system shielded you, every time people like me, people who look like me, were forced to swallow the bitter pill of injustice, told there'd be no reckoning for men like you, you grew bolder. You thought you'd always walk away unscathed. His breath quickened, his mind a chaotic whirlwind grasping for a lifeline, anything to tilt the scales back in his favor. You're trying to make this about race, he snapped, desperation clawing at his words as he latched onto the only defense he could muster. This isn't about race, it's some personal vendetta you've got against me. Judge Carter leaned forward then, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes locking onto his with a ferocity that twisted his gut into knots. Don't, she warned, her voice hardening into steel, sharp and unyielding. Do not stand in my courtroom and try to twist this into something it's not. This isn't a vendetta. This isn't revenge. This is just a something you've dodged your entire life. His mouth opened again, but the words withered on his tongue, his breathing rapid, the room shrinking around him until the walls seemed to press in from all sides. She turned to the folder on her desk, her fingers flipping through the pages with a meticulous care that felt like a countdown to his doom. These complaints against you, she said, tapping the thick stack with a single finger. Do you know how many there are? He stayed silent, his chest heaving, unable to muster a response. Dozens, she answered for him, her voice steady and cold. Dozens of reports, people you've harassed, people you've abused, voices buried beneath layers of red tape and indifference. But today, Officer Morris, that ends. His chest rose and fell to fast now, his mind screaming at him to fight, to reclaim the narrative, to seize contraband. There was nothing left to hold onto. Judge Carter closed the folder with a soft thud, folding her hands before her as if sealing his fate. You will be removed from duty immediately, she declared, and his breath snagged in his throat, a sharp, choking sound. An internal investigation will be launched into every single complaint ever filed against you. And I assure you this time, they will not be buried. It was as if the air had been sucked from his lungs, his knees trembling beneath him, threatening to give way. He forced them to hold, locking his stance even as his voice cracked. Yo, you can't do this. You can't just. I can, she interrupted, her tone absolute, a gavel in itself. And I will. His vision blurred, his thoughts spiraling into a frantic mess, clawing for something to anchor him. I have rights, he choked out, the irony lost in the desperation consuming him. For years, Officer Morris, you've trampled on the rights of others, she replied, her voice unwavering, a pillar of resolve. Now, you'll finally understand what it means to have your power stripped away. He shook his head wildly, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This is wrong. This is all wrong. You can't just. Judge Carter raised a hand, a simple gesture that silenced him as she signaled to the bailiffs at the room's edge. Escort Officer Morris out of my courtroom. The words were a detonation, shattering the last vestiges of his world. The bailiffs moved forward, their steps heavy and deliberate, their faces carved from stone, expressionless, professional, yet somehow condemning. Their hands clamped onto his arms, firm and unyielding, and he jerked against them instinctively. A futile rebellion against the inevitable, but there was no escaping this, no victory to be claimed. The room watched in silence as they guided him toward the doors, each step a leaden weight. His breath sharp and ragged, his pulse a deafening roar. His body burned not just with shame, but with a disbelief so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. Just before they forced him through the threshold, Judge Carter's voice rang out one final time. Officer Morris. He froze, his back rigid, his hands trembling where they hung at his sides. He didn't turn, didn't dare meet her gaze, but he listened, every nerve attuned to her words. I want you to remember this moment, she said, her voice steady as granite. I want you to remember what it feels like to have no power, to have your future decided by someone else, to know that no matter what you say, no matter how hard you fight, you cannot change what's coming. A deep, suffocating silence blanketed the room. broken only by the faint creak of the doors swinging open. Because that, she continued, her words a final, unshakable decree, is what you've inflicted on countless others. And now, Officer Morris, you will finally understand what it means to answer for it. With that, the bailiffs pulled him through the doors, away from the courtroom, away from the life he'd known, away from the power he'd wielded with such reckless ease. For the first time, he was nothing, no badge, no authority, no one to shield him. The hallway beyond was a stark, echoing void, the kind of quiet that follows a storm's end. An irreversible shift. Flanked by the two bailiffs, their grips unyielding, Bradley stumbled forward, his body tense, his breath shallow and uneven. His mind raced, a frantic jumble of denial and bargaining, searching for a crack in this nightmare. A way to rewind the clock. But there was no high-ranking officer to call, no system rigged to protect him, no ally willing to erase this reckoning. He'd walked into that courtroom a man cloaked in power, and now he emerged stripped bare, facing the raw, unfiltered consequences of a life spent abusing it. The lesson was clear, etched into every fiber of his being as he staggered down that barren hallway. Justice, when it finally arrives, spares no one, and the fall from power is a brutal, humbling descent for Bradley Morris. It was a truth he'd never understood until it claimed him completely. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with the scent of polished wood and stale tension, as Bradley Morris strode out, a man who had once carried himself with the unshakable swagger of someone who'd never tasted defeat. Now, each step he took away from that suffocating chamber felt like dragging chains across the floor, the weight of his reality pressing down harder with every inch he moved. For years, he'd thrived in a world where power was his birthright, where control bent to his will like soft clay in his hands. But today, that world had crumbled, and the unfamiliar sting of helplessness gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. The walls of the courthouse, once a backdrop to his reign, now loomed like silent sentinels, closing in with every breath he took, shrinking the space around him until it felt as though the air itself was squeezing the life from his lungs. As he shuffled down the corridor, flanked by officers who'd once nodded at him in deference, he felt the weight of their staresome glinting with a quiet, smug satisfaction, others wide with disbelief that bordered on betrayal. These were the same clerks, bailiffs, and aides who'd seen him stride through these halls countless times, his badge gleaming like a crown, his voice booming with authority no one dared question. They'd whispered about him in break rooms, traded stories of his brashness, his iron grip on every situation, rumors that had only fed his legend. But now that legend was unraveling, thread by thread, leaving behind a man stripped bare. No longer Officer Morris, the untouchable enforcer. He was just Bradley, a figure in a wrinkled uniform, escorted out like a common crook, his career slipping through his fingers like sand he couldn't hold. One of the bailiffs beside him, a stocky man named Jenkins with a face weathered by years of stoic duty, broke the silence. His voice came low and steady, cutting through the fog of Bradley's spiraling thoughts. "You're gonna have to hand over your badge and gun." The words landed like a fist to Bradley's gut, each syllable a hammer driving the nail deeper into the coffin of his identity. His jaw locked so tight he could feel the strain in his teeth, a dull ache spreading through his skull as he fought the wave of sickness rising in his throat. He'd known this moment was coming. Judge Carter's voice still echoed in his ears, crisp and final. "You will be removed from duty immediately." But hearing it spelled out now, blunt and unadorned, stripped away the last shred of denial he'd clung to. His hand drifted to the badge pinned to his chest, its cool metal once a comforting weight, a symbol of everything he'd built over 13 years. Now it burned against his skin, an anchor dragging him under. His fingers shook as he fumbled with the clasp, the slight tremble betraying the storm raging inside him, anger, shame, disbelief all churning together in a bitter brew. When he finally pried it free and dropped it into Jenkins' outstretched hand, the absence hit him like a physical wound. His chest felt hollow, a gaping void where pride had once lived. Jenkins didn't flinch, didn't soften the moment with a glance of pity. He just waited, palms still extended, for the next surrender. Bradley's gun came next, the holster unstrapping with a slow, deliberate rasp that echoed in the quiet corridor. That weapon had been an extension of him, its weight a quiet promise of dominance. A tool that silenced rooms before he even spoke. Handing it over felt like peeling away his skin, leaving him raw and exposed. A man who'd never imagined vulnerability could feel so visceral. Jenkins gave a curt nod, stepping back with the items cradled in his grip like relics of a fallen king. "Internal Affairs will reach out," he said, his tone clipped, professional. "Carrying the faintest edge of detachment, you'll need to cooperate fully with the investigation." Bradley barely registered the words. His mind was trapped in a loop, the ghost of the badge's weight still lingering in his palm. The judge's verdict ringing like a death knell. The sickening realization that this wasn't some fleeting punishment he could outmaneuver. This was permanent, a reckoning he couldn't charm or bully his way out of. His hands balled into fists, knuckles whitening as he forced his shoulders back, clinging to the tattered remnants of his dignity. He wouldn't let them see him crack, not Jenkins, not the gawking courthouse staff, not the world waiting to feast on his ruin. But as they steered him toward the side exit, away from the bustling main doors, the full force of his collapse slammed into him like a tidal wave. Outside, the chaos waited. Cameras flashed like lightning. A swarm of reporters buzzing with predatory excitement, their microphones thrusting forward like spears. Questions flew at him, sharp and relentless. "Officer Morris, do you have a statement? What happened in there? Did you think you'd get away with it?" The story had already broken, leaking like poison through the cracks of the courthouse, made from a clerk who'd typed up the ruling with a smirk, maybe from an onlooker who'd caught the moment his world imploded. It didn't matter who'd lit the fuse. The explosion was public now, his shame destined to splash across every screen, dissected by every voice that had ever despised men like him. For the first time, he understood the other side of hunted, not the hunter. The way the lenses tracked his every flinch, the way accusations sliced through the air, the way the ground seemed to buckle beneath him. It was a mirror of every life he'd crushed under his boot, every soul he'd left trembling in his wake. Somewhere in the throng, a laugh cut through the noise, harsh, bitter, dripping with vindication. Bradley didn't turn to find its source, didn't need to. It seared into him anyway, a branding iron on his pride. This was justice, raw and unfiltered, the kind he'd scoffed at, dismissed as weakness when it wasn't his to wield. Now it roared toward him, unstoppable, a storm of consequences he'd never believed could touch him. His breath came faster, shallow and ragged, as the officers hustled him toward a waiting car. The door slammed shut with a thud that reverberated in his bones, sealing him inside a cage of tinted glass. The courthouse faded into the distance, but its shadow clung to him, heavy and inescapable. Inside the vehicle, the driver, officer he vaguely recognized, a young guy with a buzz cut and a stony expression, muttered something about procedure. His voice a dull hum beneath the chaos in Bradley's head. Regret twisted like a knife in his gut, tangled with fury and a disorienting haze of disbelief. How had it come to this? How had years of invincibility unraveled so fast? Had he really been so drunk on his own myth that he'd never seen the cliff's edge, until he was already falling? The city rolled past the window streets he'd once ruled, corners where his name had carried weight, faces that had flinched at his approach. Now, those same streets stared back, indifferent, their rhythm unbroken by the man who'd once owned them. He was a ghost now, a spectator to his own collapse. His phone buzzed against his thigh, an insistent jolt that made his skin crawl. He didn't reach for it. He could already picture the flood texts from colleagues hedging their bets, some feigning loyalty while others quietly cut ties, calls from the brass demanding silence, emails from vultures in the press hungry for a soundbite. It was all noise, meaningless static against the roar of his undoing. The car slowed as it neared the precinct, the squat brick building rising like a judge of its own. Once, he'd walked its halls like a lion, every nod and salute reinforcing his reign. Now, it loomed cold and unwelcoming, a monument to everything he'd lost. The driver shifted the car into park, his hands lingering on the wheel, tension rippling through his grip as if he wanted to say more, but thought better of it. Finally, he spoke, voice flat but edged with something unspoken. "Look, you should probably lay low for a while." Bradley didn't respond, his gaze fixed straight ahead, jaw rigid, body coiled tight. Lay low, the idea was laughable. a bitter joke when the world outside was already tearing him apart. But beneath the defiance, a deeper truth settled in. This was only the beginning. Justice didn't just knock, it kicked down the door, and the consequences of his arrogance, his abuse of power, were finally here to collect. For the first time, Bradley Morris understood what it meant to be powerless, and the lesson carved itself into his soul with every passing second. Bradley Morris let out a jagged breath, the kind that caught in his throat and scraped its way out, his head shaking as if he could dislodge the chaos swirling inside him. "You think I don't know that?" His voice trembled with a raw edge, a mix of desperation and something feral, like a wounded animal cornered with nowhere to run. "You think I don't feel every damn second of this unraveling right in front of me?" His words hung heavy in the stale air of the patrol car, thick with the scent of worn leather and faint cigarette smoke. The officer in the driver's seat didn't respond immediately. His exhale was slow and deliberate, a sound that carried the weight of resignation. He tilted his head slightly, catching Bradley's reflection in the rearview mirror. The man's face was a blank slate, unreadable, his eyes shadowed under the brim of his cap. After a long moment, he muttered, "I'm just saying, man, it's bad. Worse than you're letting yourself believe. You need to brace yourself for what's coming." His tone was low, almost reluctant, like he hated being the one to deliver the blow but knew it couldn't be avoided. Bradley's stomach twisted violently, a cold, coiling sensation sinking deep into his core. He'd already sensed the gravity of the situation, had felt it pressing down on his shoulders. Like a physical force bit, the officer's quiet warning made it sharper, more immediate. The reality pierced through the haze of denial he'd been clinging to. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words died before they could form. His tongue felt heavy, useless. He didn't trust himself to speak, didn't trust that his voice wouldn't crack and betray the fear gnawing at him. The officer said nothing more. With a faint click, he reached over and unlocked the doors, the sound echoing in the tense silence. Then he waited, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his posture stiff but patient. Bradley didn't move right away. His body felt leaden, as if his limbs were resisting the inevitable. The simple act of stepping out of the car seemed monumental, a final surrender to the storm that had been building around him. He stared at the door handle, his chest tight, his breathing shallow. But there was no escaping. I knew that. With a trembling hand, he gripped the handle, shoved the door open, and forced himself out onto the cracked pavement. The air outside hit him like a wall, thick and oppressive, carrying the faint tang of exhaust and the distant hum of the city. It wrapped around him, heavy with the consequences he could no longer outrun. As he trudged up the precinct steps, each one creaking faintly under his boots, he felt the atmosphere shift. Inside, the buzz of activity slowed as he approached the glass doors. Officers who once clapped him on the shoulder, who once shared quick grins or knowing nods, now averted their eyes. Some muttered under their breath, their voices too low to catch but sharp enough to sting. Others watched him from the corners of their vision, their gazes flickering over him, curious, judgmental, maybe even satisfied. Were they pitying him, or were they secretly savoring the sight of his fall? He couldn't tell, and that uncertainty burned worse than anything else. He squared his shoulders and pushed through the doors, forcing his legs to carry him forward even as every muscle screamed to turn back. The station assaulted his senses. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow that made his eyes ache. The air was unnaturally still, tinged with the faint metallic bite of old coffee and the lingering sweat of too many bodies. In a confined space, he'd walked these halls 1,000 times, but today they felt alien, cold, unwelcoming. At the center of the room stood Captain Reynolds, his superior, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The man's face was a fortress, stern, unyielding, with a flicker of something Bradley couldn't quite name, disappointment, contempt, whatever it was. It wasn't warmth. Bradley stopped short, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. "Follow me," Reynolds said, his voice clipped and final. He turned sharply, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum as he strode toward a back office. Bradley hesitated, his boots rooted to the floor for a fleeting second, before he willed himself to move. Each step felt like wading through quicksand, dragging him closer to a reckoning he couldn't avoid. The office door loomed ahead, its frosted glass pane a blurry barrier between him and whatever awaited inside. Reynolds didn't speak until the door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in the small, cluttered room. He leaned against the edge of his desk, rubbing a hand over his weathered face, his fingers lingering over the deep lines etched into his skin. When he finally looked up, his eyes met Bradley's with an intensity that wasn't quite anger, but carried no trace of softness either. "You really screwed up this time, Morris," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the air like a blade. Bradley's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to protest, to lash out, but Reynolds sliced through the silence before he could. "Don't. Just don't." The captain shook his head again, a slow, deliberate motion that carried the weight of exhaustion. "I've pulled strings for you more times than I can count. Covered your tracks, made excuses. But this is beyond me." Bradley's stomach lurched, a sickening twist that made his knees feel weak. He wanted to argue God. How he wanted to. He'd seen worse swept under the rug, watched other officers walk away from scandals that dwarfed his own mistakes. He'd seen the system bend and twist to protect its own, time and time again. But deep down, beneath the anger and the defiance, he knew this was different. This wasn't a minor infraction or a hushed-up misstep. This was a glaring, public fracture, a wound too deep to stitch closed. Reynolds' gaze bore into him, steady and unflinching. "They're launching a full investigation. Internal Affairs is already on it. You're suspended, effective immediately, indefinite." The words slammed into Bradley like a fist to the gut, stealing the air from his lungs. He'd braced for it, known it was coming, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way he hadn't prepared for. "You're just gonna throw me to the wolves." His voice came out rough, bitter, laced with a betrayal he couldn't mask. "After everything I've done for this department." Reynolds' jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. "You did this to yourself, Bradley," he said flatly, "and I can't save you from it. No one can." Something inside Bradley splintered a deep, ugly crack that echoed through his chest. For years, he'd built his life on the belief that he was untouchable. He'd walked through the world with a swagger, certain that no matter how far he pushed, someone would always be there to catch him, to smooth over the wreckage he left behind. But now, standing in this cramped office under the weight of Reynolds' steady gaze, he felt that illusion shatter. He was alone, stripped bare, with no one left to shield him from the consequences of his own arrogance. Reynolds straightened, running a hand over his face once more before nodding toward the door. "Go home, Morris. Let this play out." Bradley didn't budge at first. Every instinct roared at him to fight, to scream, to demand they see how unjust this was. But justice wasn't the point, not anymore. For the first time, he was the one who had to face the fallout, and there was no fairness in that. Without a word, he turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him with a dull thud. The station was quieter now, the hum of activity dulled by the late hour. He moved through the halls like a ghost, past officers who barely glanced his way, past desks where he'd once belonged. Faces that once lit up with camaraderie now turned away, their silence louder than any reprimand. As he stepped outside, the night air hit him like a wave, thick and suffocating, settling deep in his chest. He stood at the top of the precinct steps, his hands balled into fists, his body rigid against the storm raging inside him. His mind was a battlefield, thoughts crashing into one another, splintering apart, then sharpening into something dark and relentless. The humiliation clung to him, a second skin he couldn't shed. Hours earlier, he'd strode into Judge Naomi Carter's courtroom with the unshakable confidence of a man who'd never known real accountability. He'd stood before her, chest puffed out, certain that his badge, his reputation, his connections would carry him through. But she'd seen through him, her piercing gaze cutting past the bravado to the rot beneath. In that courtroom, surrounded by murmurs and the rustle of papers, his power had been stripped away, piece by piece, in front of people who'd once feared him. There'd been no leniency, no winks or nods from the system he'd manipulated for years. Just cold, unflinching justice. His eyes swept the street below, the blurred lights of passing cars smearing across his vision. His reputation was in ruins. The department had already begun to erase him, distancing itself as if he were a contagion. Officers who'd once walked beside him, who'd laughed at his jokes and covered his mistakes, now treated him like a stranger. He could feel their eyes on him, still watching from the windows, from the shadows, judging, waiting for him to crumble. He was no longer one of them. He was a warning, a story they'd tell over beers years from now. Remember Bradley Morris? Thought he was invincible. Look what happened to him. His hands twitched, fingers curling as he fought the urge to scream, to demand someone fix this nightmare. But there was no fixing it. No one was coming. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a relentless vibration he'd ignored too many times already. With a sharp exhale, he yanked it out, his grip tightening until his knuckles whitened. The screen glowed with a familiar number, his wife. A fresh wave of dread coiled in his gut. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, before finally pressing it to his ear. "Yeah," he forced out, his voice a gravelly rasp. Silence greeted him, thick and heavy, followed by a faint hesitation. Then her voice came through, steady but threaded with something he couldn't pin down. Fear? Resignation? Bradley. His name in her mouth felt like a weight dropping. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. What? Another pause. In the background, he caught the faint drone of the TV, the murmur of a world that kept spinning while his own ground to a halt. "You need to come home," she said, and something in her tone, quiet, urgent, made his stomach clench tighter. He shifted, glancing around the empty street as if someone might be lurking, watching. "I'm on my way," he muttered, then hung up, the line going dead in his hand. As he descended the steps, the weight of it all pressed harder against him. He'd spent years believing he could bend the world to his will. That power was his to wield without consequence. But now, drowning in the wreckage of his own making, he saw the truth. Justice, when it came, spared no one, not even those who thought themselves above it. And the cost of his hubris was a lesson he'd carry alone, step by heavy step, into the uncertain dark ahead. Bradley shoved the phone back into his pocket with a force that betrayed his unease, his fingers trembling slightly as he descended the stairs two at a time. His movements were rigid, mechanical almost, as if his body were a machine fighting to keep itself together. Inside, a restless energy pulsed through him, a gnawing sensation he couldn't name, something between dread and defiance that churned in his gut. Like a storm gathering strength, he didn't know what awaited him at home, but the sinking feeling in his chest told him it wouldn't be anything he wanted to face. The drive back was a haze, the world outside the car blurring into streaks of gray and shadow as his mind spun wildly. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles stood out stark and white against the worn leather, the tension radiating up his arms. His thoughts looped endlessly, a relentless reel of every misstep, every choice, every damning word Judge Naomi Carter had flung at him earlier that day. Her voice echoed in his skull, sharp and unyielding, peeling away his defenses layer by layer until he was left raw, exposed, suffocating under the crushing weight of his own actions. When he finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before him, its familiar silhouette somehow altered. It seemed smaller, shrunken, as though the life it once held had seeped out of its walls. What had always been a refuge now felt like a battleground, its windows dark and unwelcoming. His stomach twisted violently as he stepped out of the car, his legs heavy, each movement dragging as though he were wading through mud. Exhaustion clung to him like damp cloth, but beneath it simmered something darker, something perilously close to fear. The front door was unlocked, a detail that struck him as odd, and he pushed it open with a slow, deliberate motion, stepping into the dimly lit living room. The air inside was colder than he remembered, biting at his skin, and his eyes darted around the space, searching for something anything to anchor him. Then he saw her. His wife, Ellen, stood near the kitchen doorway, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her face a mask he couldn't decipher. But her iced toast steady, piercing eye shelled something that made his breath catch, something he wasn't ready to confront. He shut the door behind him with a thud, letting out a sharp, shaky exhale. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Ellen didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, studying him, her gaze cutting through the dimness like a blade. It wasn't anger he saw, not exactly, but a quiet intensity, as though she were peeling back the layers of the man she'd married to find someone she no longer recognized. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost too soft, carrying a weight that made his skin prickle. "I saw the news." The words landed like a punch, and his stomach lurched, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He forced a scoff, shaking his head as if he could dismiss it all. "Of course you did," he muttered, his tone edged with sarcasm he didn't feel. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to his bait. She just kept watching him, her expression steady, unshaken. "They're saying there's going to be a full investigation," she continued, her voice calm but piercing. He dragged a hand over his face, exhaustion sinking deeper into his bones, settling like sediment. "It's all bullshit," he snapped, the words tumbling out too fast. "They're just making an example out of me." Ellen let out a slow, measured breath, and for a fleeting moment, something flickered across her face: disappointment, maybe, or disbelief. "Are they?" she asked, her tone deceptively simple. His head jerked up, his jaw clenching so hard it ached. "What the hell does that mean?" he demanded, his voice rising. She hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before stepping closer, her movements deliberate. "It means, Bradley," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of steel, "that maybe this isn't about them picking on you. Maybe it's about the fact that you finally got caught." The words ignited something in him, a flare of anger that roared through his chest like wildfire through dry brush. "You think I deserve this?" he shot back, his voice raw, jagged. "You think I should cut him off?" Not with anger, but with a quiet resolve that stopped him cold. "I don't know what to think anymore," she said, her eyes locked on his. "I just know that for years. I've turned a blind eye. I've ignored things I shouldn't have. And now I don't even know who you are." Her words cracked something deep inside him, a jagged fissure splitting through the foundation he'd built his life on. His hands balled into fists at his sides, his breathing uneven, ragged. "You don't get to say that," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to stand there and act like you haven't benefited from all this, our house, our car, this whole damn life. You think it just fell into our laps? You think I didn't have to make tough calls to keep it together?" Ellen's expression didn't falter, but a bitter laugh escaped her, sharp and hollow. "Tough calls?" she echoed, shaking her head. "Bradley, you terrorized people, you hurt people, and now you're pissed because someone finally said enough." His chest heaved, his entire body coiled with frustration, desperation, a storm of emotions he couldn't name. "So what? You're done? You're leaving?" he demanded, his voice breaking despite his efforts to hold it steady. She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. And when she finally spoke, her words were a quiet blade. "I don't know yet." That simple admission hit him harder than any shout, any accusation. For the first time, he saw the chasm that had opened between them, a distance he'd never noticed it or never allowed himself to notice. He'd always assumed she'd stand by him, no matter what, that she'd shield him, defend him, believe in him the way she always had. But now, standing in the cold, shadowed living room, he realized he'd already lost something far more precious than his badge, and the worst part was, he didn't know if he could ever claw it back. The world didn't pause for Bradley Morris. The days marched on, each one pulling him further from the life he'd known, from the power he'd once wielded like a scepter. His home, once a haven, became a hollow shell. Ellen drifted through it like a specter, her presence distant, her silence deafening where there had once been warmth, loyalty, understanding. He could feel her watching him, waiting for him to explain, but to decide if she could stomach the man she now saw before her. Maybe she'd always known, he thought late at night, staring at the ceiling as sleep eluded him. Maybe she'd always suspected the truth behind the late nights, the hushed phone calls, the bruises he couldn't explain. But now, the pretense was gone. The comfortable lie of a man just doing his job had shattered, and there was no piecing it back together. The investigation was a beast of its own, relentless and unyielding. Every report, every complaint, every case he'd buried under paperwork or threats clawed its way back to the surface, a slow, creeping tide that drowned him bit by bit. The media feasted on his downfall, his name splashed across headlines in bold, unforgiving print. His accents whispered about in fear were now dissected on evening news segments by people who wouldn't have dared meet his eye a year ago. Grainy body cam footage surfaced, followed by security tapes. Witness recordings, voices of the terrified, the broken, the silenced finally breaking free. Each day brought fresh revelations, each one a chisel carving deeper into the reputation he'd spent decades building. The department severed ties with surgical precision, his pension stripped away, his badges a gleaming emblem of untouchable authority reduced to a meaningless trinket. His so-called brothers in blue scattered like roaches in the light, distancing themselves, feigning ignorance, as if they hadn't laughed at his stories, hadn't turned a blind eye to his methods. Then came the charges, formal and inescapable: unlawful use of force, civil rights violations, tampering with police reports. It was a collapse unlike anything he'd ever imagined, a freefall from a height he'd never realized he'd climbed. The trial unfolded in a courtroom he'd once ruled as an enforcer of the law, now transformed into the arena of his judgment. Judge Naomi Carter presided from the bench, her presence a pillar of calm authority, her dark eyes steady and unflinching. She didn't gloat, didn't revel in his ruin. She simply sat there, the embodiment of justice, her every word measured, her every ruling final. The evidence piled up like a mountain, overwhelming, undeniable. Witness after witness took the stand, their voices trembling at first, then growing steady as they painted a portrait of a man who'd believed himself untouchable, a man who'd wielded power like a club and thought the consequences would never find him. But they had. The verdict came swiftly, the gavel's sharp crack severing the last thread of his old life. Federal prison awaited him, the very system he'd once bent to his will now turning its cold, impartial gaze upon him. When he stepped into the penitentiary, the weight of his choices crashed down with a force that stole his breath. The clang of the gate behind him was a sound he'd never forget, a final note in the symphony of his undoing. He was no longer a man with power, no longer a figure to be feared. Here, stripped of his badge, his gun, his uniform, he was nothing, just another number in the system, indistinguishable from the man he'd once caged without a second thought. The inmates knew him, though. They'd seen his face on the news, in their nightmares, some even in the flesh, their lives marked by his hands. Now, he was one of them, a fallen king in a kingdom of the condemned, and the looks they gave him promised no mercy. Beyond the prison walls, the world turned on. Judge Naomi Carter continued her work, her reputation now a fortress, her name synonymous with the kind of justice that didn't bend, didn't break. She hadn't sought his destruction for personal gain. She'd simply upheld the truth, and in doing so, she'd etched a lesson into the annals of time. No one, no matter how mighty, stood above accountability. Her courtroom became a beacon, a reminder that power unchecked was a poison, and that justice, when wielded rightly, could cleanse even the deepest stains. Ellen left him in the end, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet inevitability that stung worse than any fight. She'd spent years burying her doubts, silencing her questions, but now she refused to live in the shadow of his sins any longer. She packed her things one gray morning, her movements slow but resolute, and walked out of the house that had once been theirs. Bradley was left alone, surrounded by the echoes of a life he'd built on sand, a life that had crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. The lesson was brutal, unsparing. Power abused was a debt that demanded payment, and justice, though slow, was a creditor that never forgot. The night unfurled like a heavy cloak over the deserted road, where shadows danced with the frail glow of Amara Williams' headlights. The beams sliced through the darkness, catching the edges of weathered signs and skeletal trees swaying under a pale sliver of moonlight. The asphalt stretched endlessly before her, a narrow thread winding through dense woods and sleepy rural hamlets, where the occasional flicker of a distant porch light pierced the gloom. Inside the car, the soft hum of jazz spilled from the speakers, a gentle companion to the solitude. Amara's hands rested lightly on the wheel, her posture calm, but her mind churned with a storm of anticipation and resolve. She was driving toward a new chapter, one she knew would test every ounce of her strength and patience. Amara had just left behind a hard-earned post at the city police department, a place where she'd clawed her way up through years of relentless determination. She'd faced the sit-along glances, The murmured doubts, the subtle barbs aimed at her because of her skin and her gender. Now, she was headed to a small-town police station, a world apart from the urban bustle she knew. This wasn't just a job, it was a mission. She carried the weight of her father's wisdom in her chest, his voice echoing through the years. You can achieve anything, Amara, but you've got to stay steady, no matter what they throw at you. A retired sergeant, he'd weathered his own silent wars in uniform. Battles fought not just against crime, but against the prejudice that shadowed black officers. That legacy pulsed in her veins now, a quiet fire fueling her purpose. She wasn't here to simply clock in, she was here to uproot a rotting system, to drag it kicking and screaming into the light. The town she was bound for clung to old ways like a lifeline, its people steeped in traditions that resisted change with a stubborn grip. Amara had pored over the reports, reading the unspoken warnings woven between the lines, a tight-knit crew of officers, wary of outsiders, suspicious of anyone who didn't fit their mold. She knew what awaited hurled shoulders, barbed jests, invitations that would never come. She could already picture the smirks, the folded arms, the whispers trailing her down the station's dim halls. Her rival would stir unease, and the reforms she intended to bring would ignite outright defiance. But Amara hadn't come to win friends. She'd come to lead, to carve out justice where it had long been smothered. She exhaled slowly, steeling herself against the flicker of doubt that threatened to creep in. Self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford if she wanted to succeed. The jazz swelled, a saxophone weaving through the stillness, when a harsh glare flooded her rearview mirror. Red and blue lights pulsed behind her, shattering the night's fragile peace. Amara's stomach tightened not from fear, but from the weary recognition of what was coming. She'd been here before, too many times to count. The siren wailed, sharp and insistent, and the patrol car motioned her to the roadside. She eased off the gas, her blinker ticking steadily as she guided the car onto the gravel shoulder. The tires crunched against the stones, a gritty sound that matched the grit she summoned within. Parking, she placed both hands on the wheel, visible and still, and drew a deep breath. Whatever this was, it wouldn't be routine. Two officers emerged from the patrol car, their silhouettes stark against the flashing lights. The first, a tall man with a buzzed scalp and a stride that oozed authority, approached her window. His name tag glinted faint lisurge. The second, shorter and slouched with a lazy swagger, circled her car like a vulture eyeing prey. Raimi, she noted, catching his name as he passed. Serge tapped her window with a gloved knuckle, the sound sharp in the quiet. Amara lowered the glass, meeting his gaze. His cap shadowed half his face, but the smirk curling his lips was unmistakable. License and registration, he drawled, his voice thick with command, as if he relished the weight of it. She handed over the documents without a word, her movements deliberate. Serge took them, his eyes flicking over the papers with a scrutiny that felt more like a challenge than a check. Then he looked up, his stare lingering, heavy with insinuation. "What's someone like you doing out here this late?" he asked, the question laced with mockery. "This car doesn't really seem like your style." "Borrowed it, maybe, or just got lucky." Amara's jaw tightened, but she kept her face a mask of calm. She knew the Gemek knew the jab was meant to bait her. "I'm heading to town for work," she replied, her tone even, giving nothing away. "Is there a problem, officer?" Serge didn't answer right away. He just watched her, eyes narrowing as if he could peel back her composure with a look. Raimi, meanwhile, leaned against the passenger's side, arms crossed, his grin wide and taunting. "Work, huh?" he chimed in, his voice dripping with amusement. "Nice ride for a job. Must be something cushy." Amara stared ahead, her fingers flexing slightly on the wheel. Irritation simmered beneath her skin, but she smothered it. She'd trained herself for this years of biting her tongue, of measuring every word so it couldn't be twisted against her. She knew they wanted a reaction, a spark they could fan into a flame. Serge leaned closer, his breath brushing her cheek, his presence an intrusion. "Where you from, anyway?" he pressed, his tone sharp with suspicion. "You don't look like you belong around here." "Just passing through, I bet." Amara met his eyes briefly, unflinching. "Yes, passing through," she said smoothly. "Starting a new job here." The officers exchanged a glance, their smirks mirroring each other. Serge arched a brow, sarcasm oozing from him. "Oh yeah? What kind of work gets you a car like this? What do you do, if you don't mind me asking?" Her grip on the wheel tightened, a faint tremor of frustration she quickly buried. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, clipped but steady. Raimi let out a snicker, his grin widening as if she'd just delivered a punchline. "This one's got secrets, huh, Serge? Think she's hiding something?" Serge's sneer deepened, and he dangled her documents in the air like a trophy. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice hardening, a mix of authority and glee. Amara paused, the air thickening with tension. This wasn't a check anymore, it was a power play. But she complied, opening the door with a slow, deliberate motion. She stepped into the glow of their lights, standing a touch taller than Serge, though she kept her stance soft, non-threatening. He ignored her height, his sneer proclaiming his unshaken control. Raimi prowled around the car, inspecting it with exaggerated care. "Real nice," he taunted. "Must have cost a pretty penny." "Not bad, not bad." Inside, Amara's mind raced. She could feel the weight of their assumptions pressing down 12 men so sure of their dominion, so blind to the reckoning waiting just beyond the horizon. She thought of her father again, his stories of enduring worse than this, of holding his head high when others tried to grind him down. She thought of the station she'd soon command, of the rot she'd vowed to purge. These two didn't know it yet, but the woman they mocked was their new boss, the one who'd soon hold their fates in her hands. For now, she stood silent, letting them revel in their fleeting triumph. Justice, she knew, didn't rush it, bided its time, steady and unrelenting. Meanwhile, miles away, another soul wrestled with a different kind of reckoning. Bradley Morris sat alone in a cell, the walls closing in like the jaws of a trap he'd built himself. Time stretched before him, endless and suffocating. Each tick of the clock a hammer strike against his crumbling pride. He'd once worn his badge like armor, a shield against consequence, believing the system would always bend to his will. For years, he'd wielded power without restraint, his choices leaving a trail of broken lives' faces he could still see in the dark, eyes hollow with pain he'd inflicted. Now, stripped of his title, he had nothing but time to sift through the wreckage. Regret gnawed at him, a relentless ache, but redemption was a door forever locked. Justice had hunted him down, and when it struck, it showed no mercy. Judge Naomi Carter had been the one to swing the gavel. She'd sat behind the bench, her face a mask of solemn duty, her eyes cutting through Bradley's defiance like a blade. She hadn't acted out of spite or vengeance. Those were emotions too petty for her. No, she'd acted because it was right, because someone had to draw the line. Others before her had flinched, turned away, let men like Bradley slip through the cracks. But Naomi refused to falter. She'd seen the reports, heard the testimonies, felt the weight of every life he'd crushed. In her chambers, late at night, she'd wrestled with the burden of her role in it out of doubt, but out of reverence for the law she served. When she sentenced him, her voice was steady, her words a quiet thunder that shook the courtroom. She'd held him accountable, and in that act, she'd etched a truth into the world. Power unchecked is a poison, and justice, though slow, is a cure that spares no one. Bradley's fall was a lesson carved in stone, a warning to those who believed themselves untouchable. Amara's rise, though still unfolding, was its mirror a promise that even in the darkest corners, change could take root. Serge and Raimi, oblivious in their arrogance, were threads in the same tapestry. Their taunts a fleeting echo soon to be silenced. The night pressed on, heavy with secrets and inevitable truths. Justice didn't shout or boast, it simply moved forward, a tide no one could outrun. Amara had barely settled into the unfamiliar streets of this small town when she found herself under the scrutiny of two local officers. The night was quiet, the air thick with the hum of crickets. When their patrol car's lights flashed in her rearview mirror, she pulled over, her hands steady on the wheel, her breath even despite the flicker of unease curling in her chest. She wasn't naive, she knew this wasn't a routine stop. There was something deliberate in the way they approached, a predatory glint in their eyes that suggested they were testing her, probing for weakness. But Amara wasn't one to crumble. She sat silently, her lips pressed into a thin line, refusing to give them the reaction they craved. Sergei, the taller of the two, stepped forward. his boots crunching against the gravel as he leaned in closer to closer, his breath fogging faintly. In the chilly night air, his sharp, calculating eyes roamed over her face, searching for something to latch onto, some hint of fear or fragility. He tilted his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "So," he drawled, his voice laced with suspicion, "what kind of job has you cruising around in a slick car like this at night? Doesn't add up. You don't look like you're telling the truth about whatever it is you do." His words were a baited hook, dangling in front of her, waiting for her to snap. Amara met his gaze without flinching, her dark eyes steady as stone. Inside, her pulse quickened, but her voice betrayed none of it, calm, measured, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm a police officer," she said simply, pausing for effect before adding, "and starting tomorrow. I'll be your new captain." The words landed like a thunderclap in the stillness. She watched as Sergei's smug expression faltered, his eyes widening in a fleeting moment of disbelief. The sneer melted from his lips, replaced by a flicker of shock he couldn't quite mask. His confidence, so carefully constructed, crumbled like dry earth beneath her steady stare. Beside him, Raimi erupted into laughter, the sound harsh and jarring against the quiet night. He doubled over, slapping his knee as if Amara had just delivered the punchline of the century. "Captain," he wheezed, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're joking, right? Our captain." His amusement echoed off the empty road, but there was an edge to it, a nervousness he couldn't fully hide. Sergei, meanwhile, stood frozen, his cold, piercing eyes locked on her. For a moment, he said nothing, his jaw tightening as he processed the revelation. Then, with a sharp click of his tongue, he stepped back, his disdain palpable. "You're trying to pull one over on us," he said, his tone low and accusatory. "If you were really our captain, we'd know by now." Amara didn't waver. "You'll find out tomorrow," she replied, her voice unshaken, a quiet steel running through it. "Now, am I free to go, or do you want to keep this little chat going?" She could see the shift in Sergei's demeanor. His eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them. He didn't like this, didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he'd assumed he could cow into submission. For a split second, she thought he might lash out, his hand twitching as if itching to act. But he reined himself in, his composure snapping back into place like a taut wire. With a grunt of irritation, he shoved her documents back into her hands, his fingers brushing hers with deliberate force. "Get going," he snapped, his voice rough and bitter. "But don't let us catch you speeding. Next time, we won't stop at just checking your papers." She nodded, unfazed by the thinly veiled threat, and slid back into her car. The tension coiled tight in her chest, but her face remained a mask of calm as she turned the key in the ignition. Sergei leaned down to her window one last time, his lips curling into a menacing smile. "Who do you think you are?" he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "Don't think you can just waltz into this town without a fight." Amara didn't dignify it with a response. She gave him a slight nod, rolled up the window with a soft hum, and pulled away, the patrol car's lights shrinking in her mirror as she drove into the night. The insult lingered, sharp and bitter, but she pushed it down. Tomorrow, she told herself, would be a reckoning. The road stretched out before her, dark and endless, the silence broken only by the low rumble of her engine. But then, in the distance, those flashing lights reappeared, tailing her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Her stomach tightened, a mix of frustration and resolve settling in. She wasn't running from this now, not ever. She pulled over again, this time on her own terms, stepping out into the cool air with deliberate grace. She stood tall, arms crossed, watching as the patrol car rolled up slowly, its tires crunching against the pavement. Sergei and Raimi emerged, but the playful taunting from before was gone. Now, their faces were hard, their eyes glinting with something colder, more dangerous. Sergei approached first, his expression sly and unreadable. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a banana. He pressed it into her hand with a mocking flourish, his lips twisting into a cruel grin. "Hold this," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "Now put it on your head." Amara's brow furrowed, her fingers tightening around the fruit as she studied him, trying to decipher his game. Sergei's chuckle was low and chilling, while Raimi stood back, arms crossed, his scornful gaze boring into her. "Put the banana on your head," Sergei repeated, his tone sharpening into a command. "Or are you scared?" The absurdity of it hit her first, followed by the sting of humiliation. This wasn't just a prank, it was a calculated move. A test to strip her of her dignity before she even stepped into her role. They wanted to see if she'd bend, if she'd play their game and let them dictate her worth. Her heart pounded, a surge of anger rising like bile in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't let them see her crack, not yet. With a slow, deliberate motion, she raised the banana and balanced it atop her head, her eyes locked on Sergei's. There was no fear in her stare, no surrender, just a quiet defiance that seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst could have. Sergei stepped back, exchanging a triumphant glance with Rami. "Always wanted to take a shot at a small target like this," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear, his hand drifting to the holster at his hip. Rami laughed again, a harsh, grating sound. "You hitting that would take some skill, Serge." The gesture was clear, an unspoken threat, a reminder of the power they thought they held. Amara's pulse raced, the possibility of violence hanging heavy in the air, but she stood her ground, her expression unyielding. Inside, she burned with a fury she kept tightly leashed. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. After a long, tense moment, Sergei's hand dropped from his gun. "I'll let you off this time," he sneered, tossing the banana to the ground with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "But next time won't be so easy." He turned away, Rami trailing behind him, their laughter fading as they climbed back into their car and drove off. Amara remained where she stood, the weight of the insult crashing over her like a tide. She felt the sting of it deep in her bones, but she forced herself to breathe, to let the anger settle into something colder, something sharper. Tomorrow, she vowed, she'd turn the tables. The next morning, Amara arrived at the police station before the sun had fully risen, the sky still streaked with pale pinks and grays. She stepped out of her car, her uniform crisp and pristine, every crease ironed to perfection. The captain's badge on her chest gleamed in the dim light, a silent declaration of her authority. As she crossed the parking lot, her boots clicked against the asphalt with a steady rhythm, her posture radiating a quiet strength. Inside, the station was hushed, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and paper. The desk officer, a weary man with thinning hair, looked up as she entered, his eyes widening in surprise. "Good morning, Captain Williams," he stammered, fumbling over his words. "We, didn't expect you this early." His voice wavered, his unease betrayed by the way he shifted in his seat. "I prefer to be early," Amara replied, her tone even and polite, though her gaze swept the room with purpose. The few officers present avoided her eyes, busying themselves with paperwork or staring intently at their screens. She moved through the space, her presence commanding without effort, until she reached the far end of the room. There they were, Sergei and Rami, lounging against the wall near the bulletin board, their postures relaxed, their laughter low and careless. They hadn't noticed her yet, too wrapped up in their own arrogance to sense the shift in the air. She stopped, watching them for a moment, letting the silence build. Then Sergei glanced up, and the change was instantaneous. The smirk vanished from his face, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. His skin paled, the bravado draining from him like water from a cracked glass. He stood straighter, his hands twitching at his sides as if unsure what to do with themselves. Rami turned next, following Sergei's gaze, and his reaction was even more telling, a raised eyebrow, a hard swallow, a flicker of dread crossing his features. They looked like boys caught red-handed, their earlier swagger replaced by a raw, unguarded panic. "Good morning," Amara said, her voice clear and resonant, slicing through the stillness. "I believe you both had the pleasure of meeting me last night." Sergei opened his mouth, struggling to find his footing. "Wu didn't know," he managed, his voice trembling slightly. "Sorry, Captain. It was just a small misunderstanding." Amara arched an eyebrow, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass as it moved between them. "A misunderstanding," she echoed, her tone cool and precise. "I don't think it's small when you choose to degrade someone you've just met, especially when that someone happens to be your superior." Rami stared at the floor, his shoulders hunching as if he could shrink away from her scrutiny. Sergei cleared his throat, desperation creeping into his voice. "Captain, we were just messing around. We didn't know it was you." Amara stepped closer, her presence towering despite her calm demeanor. "That's exactly the problem," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "You didn't know me, so you thought you could act however you pleased. If that's your idea of professionalism or justice, Ethan, we've got a lot to redefine here." The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of her words settling over them like a storm cloud. She could see the lesson sinking in. The realization that power misused carried consequences they couldn't escape. Sergei and Remy had thought they could toy with her, bend her to their will, but they'd underestimated her resolve. Justice, she knew, wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability, about facing the fallout of your choices. And as she stood there, unwavering, she made it clear, their days of unchecked arrogance were over. The heavy stillness that blanketed the police department's main room was palpable, a tense quiet that seemed to ripple outward as every pair of eyes slowly gravitated toward the unfolding scene. Staff members, scattered across the space, shifted in their seats or paused mid-task, their expressions a blend of intrigue and wariness. It was as though the air itself carried a warning. Something significant was happening, and the new captain standing at the center of it all was not someone to underestimate. Amara, with her posture rigid and her presence commanding, let the silence stretch out deliberately, savoring the faint flicker of discomfort dancing in the eyes of the two officers before her Sergei. And Remy, their unease was almost tangible, a quiet storm brewing beneath their forced composure. Then, with a subtle tilt of her chin, she broke the stillness, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, sharp, unwavering, leaving no space for excuses. "Listen closely," she said, her gaze locking onto Sergei and Remy with an intensity that pinned them in place. "As of this moment, I am your captain. I won't stand for any hint of disrespect, whether it's bold enough to see in broad daylight, or sly enough to slip through the cracks. Last night's behavior, if I catch even a whiff of it again, there will be consequences, and they'll hit hard." Sergei attempted a smile, a crooked, awkward thing that withered under her stare, managing only a stiff nod as he muttered, "Understood, Captain. We'll stick to your orders." But Amara wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, her tone turning to steel. "This isn't just about following orders like trained dogs. I expect professionalism woven into every move you make, every word you breathe. No half measures, no exceptions. This isn't a playground, and I'm not here to win your affection, I'm here to lead." The room felt as if it had been plunged into ice, the weight of her words settling over everyone like frost. Sergei and Remy bowed their heads, their bravado stripped away, leaving them exposed and humbled in the wake of her authority. Amara could feel the collective gaze of the department pressing against her, a silent audience absorbing the raw power of her first impression. She held her stare on the two officers, unrelenting, before adding one final, piercing note. "And one more thing, there's going to be an internal investigation into what happened last night. Power trips, disrespect, discrimination of that has a place here. I'll see to it that everything is dragged into the light, handled with fairness and transparency." The color drained from Sergei's and Remy's faces, their earlier confidence replaced by a dawning realization. Last night wasn't a fleeting misstep, to be brushed aside. It was a reckoning, and Amara wasn't just any captain, she was a force intent on uprooting rot wherever it festered. With that, she turned on her heel and strode into her office, the door clicking shut behind her with a quiet finality. The space was unassuming, a broad wooden desk dominating the center, a modest bookshelf tucked against the back wall, and a handful of chairs arranged for meetings. Yet to Amara, it was more than a room. It was a sanctuary of purpose, a command post where she would wage her war for respect and accountability. She sank into the chair behind the desk, exhaling deeply as the weight of her new role settled over her shoulders. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before diving in, pulling up files that painted a grim picture of the department's past reports, of sloppy internal procedures, unresolved complaints, and a backlog of grievances from citizens who'd been let down time and again. It was clear this place had been coasting on lax standards for far too long. Her pen scratched across a notepad as she jotted down the most glaring issues, her mind already spinning with plans to restore order and integrity. A soft knock at the door broke her focus, and she glanced up to see Lieutenant Hannah framed in the doorway. In her mid-40s, Hannah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen it all, sharp eyes glinting. Beneath a composed expression, her posture straight but not rigid. Amara had read about her, a seasoned officer with a reputation for professionalism, though she tended to steer clear of the department's messier squabbles. "Captain Williams, I'm Hannah," she said, her voice polite but tinged with a cautious distance. "Welcome to the department. I heard you had a run-in with a couple of officers already." Amara offered a calm nod, gesturing for Hannah to take a seat as a faint smile softened her features. "Yes, but I dealt with it. It comes with the territory. Change doesn't always roll out a welcome mat." Hannah studied her for a beat, as if weighing her words against some internal scale, then replied, "Couldn't agree more. Just so you know, some folks here are stuck in their ways-old habits die hard. But there are others who'd like to see things improve. They just need a nudge, maybe a little trust, to get there." Amara felt a spark of possibility in Hannah's words, sensing that this woman could be more than just a bystander, perhaps an ally. In the uphill battle ahead, "I'll need people like that," Amara said earnestly, meeting Hannah's gaze. "People willing to back real change. Trust is where it starts, and I'm not here to bulldoze anyone. I'll prove we can do better, one step at a time." The exchange was brief, but as Hannah rose to leave, Amara caught a flicker of openness in her demeanor, a hint that not everyone in this station was poised to resist her. Alone again, she leaned back in her chair, a quiet hope taking root. Allies like Hannah could be the key to breathing life into her vision. Restless to see more, Amara pushed herself up and stepped out into the station, determined to gauge the pulse of the place firsthand. As she moved through the rows of desks, she noticed clusters of officers hunched over paperwork or murmuring in low tones. The moment her shadow fell across them, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward her with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She pressed on, her boots echoing faintly against the tiled floor, until she reached the coffee area where a knot of younger officers lingered, steaming mugs in hand. Their chatter evaporated as she approached, replaced by awkward glances and fidgeting hands. Deciding to thaw the chill, Amara offered a small nod and a steady, "Good morning, everyone. I trust you're all off to a solid start. I'll see you at the morning meeting. We've got some new paths to chart." A young officer named Sarah, her face flushed with nerves, managed a quick, "Yes, Captain. We'll be there," her voice trembling slightly. Amara gave her a reassuring smile before turning back to her office, keenly aware of the subtle shift in the air, a ripple of change she was only beginning to stir. Back at her desk, the phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was the city mayor, his voice warm but firm as he voiced his support for her reforms. "The department's been under fire," he admitted. "Too many complaints about unfairness, too little transparency. You've got my full backing to fix it, whatever it takes." The call bolstered her resolve, a reminder that the road ahead might be steep, but she wasn't climbing it alone. She hung up, steeling herself for the morning meeting that loomed just minutes away. Officers trickled into the room, filling the seats with a quiet rustle. Sergei and Remy slunk to the back, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor, still rattled from the morning's confrontation. Amara stood at the front, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces, pausing on each one as if to imprint her determination into their minds. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady yet laced with an unmistakable edge. "I'll keep this short. Starting today, we're raising the bar, higher standards, clear respect, unshakable accountability. I know change can feel like pulling teeth, but I'm all in to make this a department people can rely on. Trust and respect aren't just words, they're the backbone of what we do." A few heads nodded, tentative but genuine, while others remained stone-faced. She pressed on, her tone hardening. "And let me be clear, abuse of power, disrespect, discrimination, those stop here. We're all equal under the law, and we'll act like it." As the meeting wrapped, she stepped out, feeling the weight of their stare, some curious, some guarded, a few tinged with reluctant admiration. She'd planted a seed, and though it hadn't yet taken root, the soil was shifting. That afternoon, Amara made good on her promise. formally launching an investigation into Sergei and Remy's conduct. From the previous night's traffic stop, she brought in independent observers, outsiders, with no ties to the departamento, ensure every step was above board. Every move the two officers had made, every word they'd spat, was dissected with meticulous care, not just to judge the incident, but to probe whether it hinted at a deeper sickness. In the department's culture, the presence of the observers sent a jolt through the station. Some officers avoided her entirely, their eyes sliding away as she passed, while others muttered their dissent in tight-lipped whispers. Amara held her course, her calm unshaken, knowing that justice demanded discomfort before it could take hold. By the third day, Sergei and Remy were summoned for questioning, their faces etched with strain as they faced the investigation team. Amara observed from a distance, not stepping into the fray but tracking every development with a hawk's focus. This wasn't just about two wayward officers, it was a clarion call to the entire force. No one was above the law, and she'd see to it that power's misuse carried a price. Hours later, the team's preliminary findings landed on her desk. Stark and unflinching, Sergei and Remy's actions weren't merely unprofessional, they were menacing, laced with prejudice, a stark violation of the badge they wore. As Amara read the report, her jaw tightened, not with surprise but with a grim certainty. This was the lesson she'd come to teach. Justice wasn't a suggestion, it was a reckoning, and those who abused their authority would find no shelter under her watch. The report had finally landed on Amara's desk, a thick stack of papers that carried the weight of months of scrutiny. It recommended disciplinary measures, a formal warning, and a temporary suspension for officers Sergei and Remy, with further review still pending. As Amara read through the findings, a quiet wave of relief washed over her, mingling with a deep satisfaction that settled into her bones. This wasn't about personal triumph. She didn't revel in the idea of punishing anyone. Instead, it felt like the first firm step toward carving out a new path for the department, a path rooted in accountability and trust. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. Disciplining seasoned officers like Sergei and Remy could stir up a storm of resentment, but Amara braced herself for it, her resolve hardening like steel in the quiet of her office. The next morning arrived with a crisp edge, the kind of day where the air felt heavy with anticipation. Amara called an emergency meeting, her heart steady but her mind racing with the words she'd prepared. As she stepped into the room, a hush fell over the gathered officers, their eyes locking onto her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. The space was dimly lit, the faint hum of the overhead lights barely audible over the tension that thickened the air. At the back, Sergei and Remy sat stiffly, their shoulders squared and jaws tight, holding back whatever protests simmered beneath the surface. Amara took her place at the front, her presence commanding without effort. "As you all know," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, though she kept it measured, "we've conducted a thorough investigation into the actions of officers Sergei and Remy following the recent incident." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, meeting every pair of eyes to drive her point home. "The findings are clear. Their conduct crossed lines of professional ethics and eroded the trust this community places in us." The silence deepened, broken only by the faint rustle of someone shifting in their seat. Amara continued, her tone firm but not harsh. "As a result, both officers will face suspension while we investigate further, and their records will reflect these violations. This isn't just about them, it's about us. I hope this serves as a wake-up call, a reminder of the standards we're bound to uphold. I won't bend on this." She could feel the room shift, the atmosphere growing taut as officers exchanged sidelong glances, their unease palpable. Some avoided her eyes, staring at the floor as if it might offer an escape from the weight of her words. Amara sensed the unspoken resistance, the flicker of doubt in their minds, but she refused to let it sway her. This was about justice, about showing that power came with responsibility, a lesson she'd learned long ago, and now intended to instill in others. When the meeting adjourned, Amara returned to her office, her steps deliberate despite the fatigue creeping into her limbs. Lieutenant Hannah was waiting there, perched on the edge of a chair with a thoughtful frown creasing her brow. She was a weary woman with sharp eyes and a quiet strength, one of the few Amara could count on in this uphill battle. I know this is going to ruffle some feathers, Hannah said, her voice low but steady. But I admire how you're handling it. People might squirm now, but they'll come around. You'll see it had to be done. Amara offered a small, grateful smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, but carried her appreciation all the same. Thanks, Hannah. I know it's not going to be a walk in the park, but if we stick to what's right, I think we can build something here, something worth believing in. With Hannah's support bolstering her spirits, Amara felt a spark of hope, though she knew this was only the opening chapter. Changing the department's culture wouldn't happen with one decision. It would take countless small stands day after day. That afternoon, Amara made her way through the department, her senses attuned to every detail. The bullpen buzzed faintly with the clatter of keyboards and the murmur of hushed conversations, but the sound dipped whenever she drew near. Officers glanced up from their desks, some with guarded expressions, others with thinly veiled resentment flickering in their eyes. A few offered subtle nods, a quiet acknowledgement of respect that she tucked away like a lifeline. She could feel the tension coiling around her, the hesitation hanging like a fog. But it only sharpened her focus. This was her proving ground, and she'd establish her authority not through intimidation, but by living the principles. She preached fairness, transparency, integrity. Before leaving for the day, she sat at her desk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room, and typed a message to the entire department. Her fingers moved with purpose over the keys. As your captain, I'm committed to ensuring this department runs on openness, fairness, and respect. My door is always open. Bring me your questions, your thoughts. We might not see eye to eye, but I hope we share a common purpose, to serve this community with everything we've got. Sincerely, Captain Amara Williams. She hit send and leaned back, gazing out the window as dusk painted the sky in deep hues of purple and gold. The message was out there now, a quiet vow to keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles. But the calm didn't last. In the days that followed, a storm brewed within the department's walls. The air grew thick with discontent, the kind that seeped into every corner and lingered like a stubborn chill. Officers muttered among themselves, their voices low but sharp with frustration. Whenever Amara passed by, she caught snippets of their words to harsh, stirring trouble. Outsider and saw the doubt etched into their faces, the anger flashing in their eyes. For those who'd thrived in the department's old ways, where rules were loose and accountability was an afterthought, Amara's presence was a thorn in their side. She wasn't surprised. She'd expected pushback from the moment she'd taken the helm. Change was a bitter pill for those comfortable in chaos, but she refused to waver. Instead, she doubled down, making time to sit with officers one-on-one, listening to their grievances and explaining her vision with a patience she didn't always feel. One morning, a message reached her desk. A group of officers, including some loyal to Sergei and Remy, were rallying against her policies. They claimed she'd overstepped, that she should have let the incident slide instead of dragging it into the light. Whispers of their defiance spread like wildfire, alliances forming in quiet corners of the precinct. Amara knew she couldn't let it fester. She called a general meeting that afternoon, her pulse steady despite the unease gnawing at her gut. The room filled slowly, officers filing in with dragging steps, their faces a mosaic of curiosity, exhaustion, and outright defiance. She stepped to the front, her posture straight, her eyes locking onto the crowd with quiet intensity. I know a lot of you aren't happy with how I've handled things, she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. And I get it, change isn't easy, but I'm not here to keep things comfortable. I'm here to make sure we operate with respect for each other, for our work, for the people we serve. A hand shot up from the crowd. Ivan, a burly officer with a mop of dark hair and a reputation as Sergei's right-hand man, stood with a scowl. Captain, do you really think all this is necessary? His tone dripped with challenge. His arms crossed tight across his chest. This place has been running fine for years before you showed up. Amara met his gaze, unflinching. I hear you, Ivan. I know this department has its history, its way of doing things. But fine isn't enough. This community deserves better. They deserve us at our best, holding ourselves to account. If we don't, who will? She let her words hang, watching as they rippled through the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, Others nodded faintly, a flicker of agreement breaking through the resistance. Ivan sat back down, his jaw tight, but the fire in his eyes dimmed just a fraction. Then came the weekend, and with it, a new clash. Sergei and Remy, still on suspension, stormed into the precinct with a handful of their loyalists in tow. The air crackled with their anger as they confronted Amara in the bullpen, their voices loud enough to draw every eye in the room. "We've been here for years," Sergei snapped, his face flushed with indignation. "And we don't need some newcomer telling us how to do our jobs. These roulettes, they are choking us." Remy stood beside him, silent but seething, his fists clenched at his sides. Amara faced them head-on, her stance unshaken despite the heat of their fury. "Sergei, Remy, everyone here," she said, her voice ringing out with a strength that silenced the room. "I respect the time you've put in, but no one gets a free pass to dodge the rules. This isn't about fixing you, it's about making sure we all answer to something bigger: integrity, accountability. If that's too much for you, maybe it's time to ask yourself what you're really here for." The silence that followed was heavy, fraught with unspoken thoughts. Some in Sergei's group faltered, their resolve wavering under her steady gaze, while others glared back with unyielding resentment. Amara stood firm, the weight of their stares pressing against her but not breaking her. This wasn't just a fight with a few rogue officers, it was a battle against a culture that had festered too long, one that prized loyalty over justice and comfort over duty. She knew the lesson here ran deep. Unchecked power bred corruption, and only by facing it head-on could true fairness take root. As the day drew to a close, Amara sank into her chair, exhaustion tugging at her limbs. The confrontations had left her drained, but beneath the weariness glowed a quiet pride. She'd held her ground, refusing to bend on the values that defined her. The road ahead stretched long and treacherous, lined with more resistance and hard choices. But step by step, she was reshaping the department, planting seeds of change that would one day grow into something solid, something just. She leaned back, her eyes tracing the fading light outside, and steeled herself for the days to come. This was her fight, and she'd see it through. In the dimly lit corridors of a bustling police department, Captain Amara Williams stood at a crossroads. The air was thick with tension, a palpable reminder of her ongoing confrontation with two seasoned officers, Sergei and Remy, whose resistance to her vision had once cast a shadow over her ambitions. Yet, Amara refused to let their opposition define her path. Instead, she turned her focus toward the younger officers, those still unjaded by years of routine, those who might still harbor a spark of idealism beneath their pressed uniforms. She sought out the ones who, like her, believed in something greater than the status quo, who might be willing to stand for the principles she held dear: justice, transparency, and respect. To bridge the gap between herself and these officers, Amara began organizing open dialogue with informal gatherings, held in the station's sparsely furnished meeting room, where the faint hum of a flickering fluorescent light overhead set the tone. The space was simple, with scuffed linoleum floors and a chipped wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs, but it became a sanctuary for raw, unfiltered conversation. She invited everyone, veterans, rookies, even the clerical staff, to share their thoughts, questions, or frustrations. No topic was off limits, no opinion too bold. At times, the discussions grew heated, voices rising as tempers flared over differing views on policy or procedure. Amara, however, remained a steady presence, her dark eyes warm yet resolute, her posture relaxed but attentive. She listened not just to respond, but to understand, anchoring even the most reticent voices to speak without fear of reprisal. It was her way of showing them that their words mattered, that they could shape the future of this department as much as she could. Among the sea of faces, one young officer caught her attention: men, a lanky figure with a quiet demeanor and a habit of lingering at the edges of the room. His uniform was always pristine, his boots polished to a mirror shine, a testament to his diligence. Yet there was a hesitance in his movements, a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze whenever the conversation turned to the changes Amara was championing. She sensed a depth in him, a sincerity that hadn't yet found its voice. One humid afternoon, as the break-room coffee maker sputtered in the background, Amara seized a chance encounter. Men stood by the counter, stirring sugar into a chipped mug, the steam curling upward in lazy tendrils. She approached with a smile that softened the lines of her face, her voice gentle but deliberate. "Men, I've noticed how hard you work every detail, every shift. You give it your all. I'd love to know what you think about the changes we're making. Do they feel necessary to you?" Min froze, his spoon clattering softly against the mug's rim. His eyes darted to hers, then away, as if weighing the risk of honesty. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant sound of a ringing phone down the hall. Then, slowly, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "Captain, I'll be honest, he wasn't sure at first. It all felt uncomfortable, like we were stirring up trouble for no reason. But watching you, seeing how you don't back down, how you explain why this matters, it's starting to make sense. I think if people could see what you see, the real value in this, they'd stand with you." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled warmly in Amara's chest. She nodded, her smile widening. "Thank you, men. That means more than you know. We need people like ya. Your spirit, your honesty'll help us rebuild trust out there." As she walked away, her steps felt lighter, her belief in officers like Min blossoming into a quiet, steadfast hope. From these exchanges, Amara began to unearth true allies, not the loudest voices or the most decorated badges, but the steady, earnest souls who shared her vision for change. They were the bedrock she could lean on, the ones who would help her reshape a department long mired in skepticism and routine. To amplify this momentum, she introduced regular training sessions, moving beyond the dry lectures of old. The room buzzed with energy as she rolled out mock scenarios, vivid, real-world challenges ripped from the streets they patrolled. One day, it was a petty dispute between neighbors escalating into shouts. The next, a delicate intervention in a case of subtle discrimination at a local shop. She stood at the front, her voice firm yet inviting, guiding them through each exercise with a blend of patience and expectation. In one memorable session, she split the officers into small groups, tasking them with navigating a discrimination case. The room filled with the murmur of debate as they huddled over notepads, scribbling ideas. Even the reluctant Oncevan with her sharp tongue, and a few grizzled veterans joined in, though their crossed arms and furrowed brows betrayed their lingering doubts. Afterward, Amara called them to share their insights with the group. A young officer named Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "I think when we ignore discrimination, or worse, when we let power go to our heads, we're not just hurting the people out there, we're hurting ourselves, too. This job means protecting every owner, race, gender, none of that should matter." Her words sliced through the room's quiet, striking a chord. Heads nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. Amara watched, a swell of pride rising within her. These weren't just officers going through the motions, they were beginning to see their role as a calling, a chance to right wrongs and uphold fairness. Even Sergei and Remy, once her fiercest detractors, showed flickers of change. In the beginning, their resentment had been a Walzurgi's icy glares across the briefing room, Remy's muttered complaints trailing her like a shadow. But as the weeks wore on, something shifted. Sergei's outright defiance softened into a guarded silence. He no longer challenged her openly, his critiques replaced by a tight-lipped restraint. Remy, too, seemed to relent, his once bitter jabs fading into begrudging acceptance. Amara knew their hearts wouldn't turn overnight, old habits clung like respite. This small surrender was a victory, a testament to the slow, relentless power of consistency and principle. It taught her a profound lesson. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about offering a path back, a chance to realign with what was right. Beyond the station's walls, Amara set her sights on the community, a patchwork of faces who'd long viewed the police with suspicion. She urged her officers to step out from behind their badges, to weave themselves into the fabric of the town. They organized meet and greets in the park, the air thick with the scent of grilled hot dogs and the laughter of children chasing balloons. They joined charity drives, hauling boxes of canned goods under a blazing sun, sweat beading on their foreheads. Amara wanted the department to be more than a force of order. She wanted it to be a neighbor, a friend, a pillar people could lean on. At a monthly wrap-up meeting, held in the same worn room where her dialogues began, an unexpected voice broke the hum of routine updates. Ivan, a weary officer with a reputation for bluntness, stood up, her hands fidgeting at her sides. "I didn't get it at first," she began, her voice rough but earnest. "I fought these chains, thought they were pointless, a waste of time. But watching you, Captain, seeing how you handle everything with, I don't know, fairness, I guess, it's opened my eyes. I was wrong to push back. We need this discipline, respect. We're finally heading somewhere good." The room stilled, all eyes on Ivan, then Amara. A warmth bloomed in Amara's chest, a quiet joy mingling with relief. Ivan, once her loudest critic, had crossed a line from resistance to belief. As the meeting ended, Amara retreated to her office, the weight of the day lifting as she sank into her chair. Outside, the city lights glittered against the dusk, a mosaic of lives she was fighting to serve. She felt a rare peace settle over her, a certainty that the road ahead, though rocky, was no longer hers to walk alone. Men, Sarah, Ivan, and others had joined her, their faith in her mission a lifeline. The department she'd dreamed of, where justice wasn't just a word but a living, breathing priority, was taking shape, brick by brick. Yet, Amara knew this was no endpoint. New challenges loomed, shadows of doubt and inertia that would test her resolve. She met them head-on, fostering more conversations, hosting potlucks where laughter mingled with strategy, and launching feedback sessions where every voice from the gruffest veteran to the shyest rookie found a place. The department's old fractures began to heal. Officers who once clashed now swapped stories over coffee, their respect for one another deepening. Sergei surprised her most, one crisp morning, as frost clung to the station's windows. He approached her desk, his broad frame filling the doorway. "Captain," he said, his voice gruff but lacking its old edge, "I've been thinking. How about we run a charity event, maybe a toy drive for the kids downtown? Could mean something to them." Amara blinked, caught off guard by the man who'd once sneered at her every move. She nodded, a grin tugging at her lips. "I'd love that, Sergei. Let's make it happen." His ideas sparked a flurry of action, officers rallying to collect donations, their chatter filling the halls with purpose. Then came the call from the mayor's officia, deep, steady voice crackling through her phone. "Captain Williams, you've done what many thought couldn't be done," he said, pride lacing his words. "The people seeth trust is coming back. Thank you for sticking with it." The praise sank into her, a balm for the sleepless nights and whispered doubts. She hung up, gazing out at the station, now a beacon of accountability and care. That weekend, as twilight painted the sky in hues of violet, Amara stood outside, watching her officers prepare for patrol. Their salutes gleamed in the streetlights, their eyes alight with a respect she'd earned through sweat and steadfastness. She returned the gesture, pride surging within her. At home that night, the silence wrapped around her like a comfort. The change she'd chased wasn't just a job, it was her soul's work, a testament to justice's power to heal and unite. Challenges would rise again, but she wasn't alone anymore. Beside her stood a team of familiarity to forge a future where fairness reigned. As she dimmed the lights and glanced at the stars, a soft smile curved her lips. Tomorrow awaited, a fresh canvas to keep justice's flame burning bright. In her heart, Amara knew this was success, not a trophy, but a legacy of courage, respect, and unshakable resolve, lighting the way for a better world.